This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Dan O'Brien, K-State grain economist, begins today's show with the grain market outlook. This week, he talks about WASDE pre-report expectations and gives an overview of exports. Keeping the show rolling is K-State veterinary entomologist Cassandra Olds with results from how the timing of burning pasture can affect tick populations differently. K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond finishes today's show with a weather update. He says while a lot of Kansas received moisture, we should still be watchful of fire dangers. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update. And as always, we're joined by K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Dan, as we're kind of at the beginning of spring now, what are you seeing for futures?
Well, we've seen, I guess, a bottoming out, or at least a moderating of the downtrend that had been happening for about the last 2 months, it seemed. And we've seen that really across the board in May corn futures, really the whole futures complex, wheat futures for sure, and also in soybeans. Now, some of that might be due to coming into the contract delivery time frame for the March contract, which started about the last day or so of February. And traders needing that had been so bearish and had so many short sell positions that they had to buy their way back out. And there's still rumors of some, I guess you'd call it basically battling back and forth of major grain traders that are working out those positions. They have basically till the middle of the month to get it done. So anyway, we're in the midst of that. But we've seen corn on Thursday. Yesterday, March corn closed at 426. It had been 13, 14 cents lower. The lowest we had gotten for that contract was down to about 410 or so. So we've come back off of that some, but at least we're not on such a 45-degree angle downward. So that you have that. You do see also that I think for now, in terms of our perspective on what'll happen in 2024, the harvest December corn futures are back up to 469, and I wouldn't be surprised if we sit at 469 today with almost no worries about production risk. If we do get some type of uncertainty, volatility in the market, from 469 is pretty easy to get up to $490, $5, et cetera. So we'll be watching for that, and seasonal trends would support the possibility of that happening. And when you look at soybean futures, March closed at 11.57 yesterday, and again that was up for the day 16 cents. November futures at 11.53. So that's thought-provoking as well. So you've got kind of the battle of 11.53 November soybeans versus 469, about 470 December corn. And from there we look at price ratios to see, is that higher or lower than 2.3, which is kind of the accepted standard. And so far, through most of the last couple of months, we've been seeing soybean prices, new crop prices being favored over D. So we'll see if that translates into higher soybean versus corn acres. And frankly, I know we have a WASDE report coming up here today, basically, but at the end of this month, in March, we'll get the USDA prospective plantings report. So that I think that's a time for our market watcher audience to have their antenna up, to be watching. Just there's potential with that new information coming out to bring a fair amount of volatility to the market. And I want to talk about wheat also. Wheat futures closed yesterday $5.34, up 18.5 cents, which sounds like a lot, but we've been really bouncing around up and down in a volatile manner in the last bit of time. That's the March contract at 5.94. Again, that's in closure. Actually, the May contract's what we're watching closer. So my mistake there. 5.74 3/4. With July at 5.61, and again, those numbers are a far away from the 6.5, 7s, and 8s we were seeing in the last year or so, but they are as they are, and at least over the last couple of weeks, we have sort of gotten ourselves out of this strong downtrend and are moving sideways now. I think from other people you've talked to on the K-State network, we have concerns about weather. Our climatologist, Chip Redmond, information for him as to how much freeze risk we might have now on the wheat going forward, and others can comment on that too. So that factor is coming into play. And really what's a change now is that we're starting to consider domestic factors in the pricing of wheat first, because it broke dormancy and it's in the field. And I'm thinking that we'll very likely get that type of concern going forward. Even as we look over the last couple of days, you have well thought out information coming out from analysts talking about how dry the last couple of weeks in February were in some key corn growing areas. So it's the time when now we start to bring these domestic production concerns into the marketplace, and we'll see how much volatility and opportunity that gives us in the grain markets.
And Dan, what are we seeing on the cash side of things?
For corn prices, again, your frame of reference is everything. Compared to where we were about a week ago, we think we're doing a lot better. but compared to where we've been in the last year, we're still quite low. We're seeing cash prices for corn. The highest bid that I could see in the Garden City area was about $4.53, about 15 basis, and everything else coming in lower. You have a Hutchinson bid about $4.43, $4.38 actually in southeast Kansas, and then again $4.33, Colby, etc. We see the continuing pattern of grain sorghum prices being a little bit higher than corn prices, but yet the forward contract bids for sorghum being at or below where corn was. Soybean prices, highest bids in the export areas coming in Hutchinson, 1146, Topeka bid, 1121, actually a southeast Kansas area bid, 1126, and new crop bids all basically 1050 to just under 11. And then wheat bids, again, if there's something that's challenging in the Kansas ag sector, it's that our wheat prices, the highest wheat prices that we've seen in the areas that we follow were a low of 504 in the Colby area for cash bids, and a high of about 560, 555 in Salina, Topeka, 554 in Hutchinson. So we're it's not that those are bad prices historically, but compared to the increases we've seen in cost of production, they're a challenge. And new crop bids are lower than those across the board. Again, 501 on the low side, 536 on the high side. So again, we're easily covering direct costs. It's when you start to figure out how much you have left on that price to cover machinery and land and family living. That's the challenge, I think.
And Dan, you mentioned that the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates is coming out today, just a little after this airs, and you have some pre-report estimates to share with us. Yeah,
really, I think people will be watching most closely the South American crop production numbers, and number to keep in mind for corn, the USDA is projecting 124 in the February report. The trade's generally thinking about 2 million metric tons lower. 156 for soybeans out of Brazil. In the February report, they're looking at about 3.5 to 4 million metric tons lower, and a fair range around that. Argentina, they're projecting about the same amount of corn production. However, there's been some dry weather, hot dry weather in the last bit of time, and we'll see if their corn and soybean numbers hold up. Changes over there end up and affect the U.S. supply-demand balance sheet, and so whatever we fall short in South America, it probably would support our exports. But right now, we're seeing, in essence, from the analyst point of view, not much change projected, almost none in terms of the index stocks for U.S. wheat, corn, and soybeans, which means if something did happen and we did get lower stocks, that it would be a surprise to the market. So there's a bit to watch in the next hour or so to see just how these numbers work out.
As we round out today's conversation then, giving a quick overview of what we're seeing for exports or the potential exports we could see.
Well, we'll start with our biggest concern, and that's for wheat. Again, a hard red winter wheat, 3.64 million bushels. compared to the pace of 4 that we needed, that we need to meet the USDA's projection, which had already been lowered about 140 million. And actually, that's up about 2 million bushels from where we were last week, which is really a bearish situation. So the question with wheat is have we dropped far enough on our prices now that we're more competitive in the world market? And it seems that perhaps we're seeing some movement in that direction, but it's not a, quote, gangbusters deal. We do see soybean exports and last week we have data for February 29th, ending that week, 52 million bushels. We need about 19 to meet the USDA's projection. So that's a great thing. That's supportive for soybean prices. Soybean meal exports were pretty good the last week or so also. So that's good. And for corn, we came in at about 46 million bushels, needed just over 50 to meet the USDA's projection. So that's been helpful, and we're bought ahead fairly well for U.S. corn also. So that's all for the good. Grain sorghum, again, we're down from last week at 9 or 10 or so million bushels, but projecting for the week ending on the 29th, about 5.3 million bushels of grain sorghum exports, and we need about 4.1 to meet the USDA's projection. So grain sorghum has been that's been blessed basically in terms of having a pretty good export pace, and as you and I have been talking for a good while now, you see that's showing up in terms of the strength of grain sorghum cash price bids relative to corn in some of these areas. And sometimes you'll be watching, particularly in South Central Kansas, bids at particular elevators, and then you'll look and one day on the screen that you're following that with, and suddenly it'll have jumped about 40 cents at one location, and you wonder what's going on. Well, they're filling a train to go somewhere, and probably something to head down to the Gulf to go into export markets. So that's kind of the mode that we're in. Of course, most of that grain sorghum, almost all of it, heading off to China right now for their purposes. A lot of domestic beverage production, from what we understand.
Dan, I appreciate you taking the time to join us once again and give us our grain market update.
Shelby, thank you very much.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about ticks and prescribed fire. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State veterinary entomologist Cassandra Olds. Cassandra, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Lovely to be here as always.
Cassandra, as we talk about ticks and prescribed fire, this was a big study you worked on, and can you tell us a little bit about how did this study come about?
So this was a really fun study we did it's all of last year, really, not just the summer. So we have the K-State Beef Stocker Unit, and they've done great work out there. And what they've done is they've been looking at prescribed burning for the past, 5 years. So it's been burned 4 times in the past 5 years. And they split the unit up into 3 sections, with one section being burnt in the fall, one section being burnt in the spring, and one section being burnt in the summer. And they were always burnt in the same season. So we have really great information on what the long-term effects of a spring burn, a fall burn, or a summer burn. And so they were getting to the end of the study, and they asked us if there's anything that we could get out of this study. And I said, well, actually, we'd love to see the impact on ticks. And we also looked at hornflies. And so we spent all of last year sampling bi-weekly to see when ticks are coming out and the number of ticks we're getting off each burn treatment.
So as you looked at all those different pastures and the different times they are burned, how many ticks and what ticks were you finding?
We have an unburned section which served as our control. So that's what we looked at as, okay, what would tick levels be like if we didn't burn? And this was really important because the published information out there is very, very hit or miss. Some studies say it really, really works. Some studies say they saw no difference. And it really comes down to the ecosystem you're in. If you're in a forested area versus grasslands area, so the impact of burning can be quite different. So we had this unburnt area, and we found a total of over 4,000 ticks in the unburnt area. In our burnt areas, we were below hundreds. For most of them, one of them went into the the hundreds marks. So if you look at it statistically, what we see is a significant reduction in ticks in our burnt areas. So whether you burn in spring, summer, or fall, no matter which season you burn, you're going to reduce ticks. When we looked at it in more detail, what we saw was that spring burning was more effective than summer or fall burning. So irrespective of when you burning on a prairie grassland ecosystem, especially if you do fall burning, not sort of patch burning, it is going to reduce your tick populations. It's going to reduce it most effectively if you burn in the spring. And there's a cool biological reason for that.
And we'll definitely talk about that here in just a moment. But beforehand, what different species of ticks did you find?
So we found 3 species. The predominant species was the one that most people are familiar with. That's the Amblyomma americanum, the Lone Star tick. This is the one where the females have that nice spot on the back. So you can always tell an adult female because it has that spot. The adult males don't actually have that spot. So this is the tick that most people encounter. That was the vast majority of our ticks. We found adult stages of a Dermacenta variabilis, which is actually a dog tick. Very common, not as common as our Amblyomma americanum. And then we found 1 or 2 Amblyomma maculatums, which is the Gulf Coast tick. And so we are on the sort of limit of where the Gulf Coast tick is, but with climate change and things getting warmer, we're seeing it come up higher. But for the most part, we have Amblyomma americanum, which is really terrible because it's like a vector of everything. And so it's the one that we probably least would like to have.
And you mentioned that spring burning is the most effective because of the tick's life cycle. So how does that work?
All insects and arthropods, that's anything with 6 or 8 legs, they do not generate their own body heat. So we generate our own body heat and we can stay warm even when temperatures are cold. These insects and related arthropods, ticks included, their temperature is regulated by the outside temperature. And so what you have is everybody's probably noticed that all the flies and ticks go away in the winter. And what they do is they enter a dormant period where they just hang out. It's a low metabolic state. They rely on the temperature, but also the number of hours of daylight. So they have special sensors that can register when it's starting to get warm and when the photo period, the amount of light is warm enough, signaling spring. And so if you burn in the spring, this year we're warming up really quickly, so we're already seeing ticks coming out. But if you burn in the spring before they can come out of that overwintering period, you're targeting them when they're very slow, they can't move, and then most importantly, not on animal hosts. So they're hanging out in the vegetation, in the leaf litter, just trying to wait for it to warm up. So that's the most impactful time to burn because you're targeting them at their most vulnerable state. If you're burning in the summer and in the fall, it still works, but you have a proportion of the population that's still on their animal host and therefore not getting burnt up, hopefully. And so we do find that spring burning is the most effective. We also see this with our hornflies. We did hornfly counts over the same pastures. And although we don't see a significant reduction in the number of flies, we do see that the overall average amount of flies that cattle grazed on spring burnt pastures is lower compared to fall and summer. And if you think about ticks and hornflies all taking a little bit of blood from the animal, you don't need to reduce the number significantly to have a significant weight gain. And it's been well published that cattle grazing on spring-burnt pastures have high weight gains. It might be me wearing my entomologist hat and thinking bugs are the cause of everything, being that part of the reason why is that we're keeping that infestation lower than it would have been at other burn times, and increasing performance of animals.
Why is this something that really cattle producers should care about?
Well, ectoparasite control is important because of the production impact. So it's multifactorial. You have the direct losses that are caused by the parasitism, the removal of the blood. And so even in animals, so we did this in stocker calves, even if you're looking at full-grown animals, like, for example, you're in a cow-calf operation, your horn flies aren't necessarily going to impact your calves as much, but for your cows, they have to eat a lot more to keep the same amount of weight on. So anytime you have a parasite that's removing blood from an animal, it has to make more of that blood. And so that's taking resources away from something else that it could be directing it to. Then you have problems of secondary infections of the bite sites, especially our amblyomma ticks, especially things like the Gulf Coast tick that I mentioned, really long mouth parts. And so you can actually get from a single tick bite, you can get a secondary infection. And then you can have flies which like to breed in this infected site. And so you can have something we call myiasis, where you have flies coming in and causing damage. And you can have death of animals as a result of that. And then we also worry about the pathogens that they transmit, especially ticks. They transmit a number of pathogens, and both to humans and to animals. And so really controlling your parasites, your external parasites, is really, really important. The big problem that we have is we've been controlling them with chemicals for a good 50 years now. And while it has worked well, I always liken it to selective breeding of dogs, right? If I want to have a big dog and it's got dots or spots, I take the puppies that look most like a big dog and might have spots, and I breed them together. And over time, I can, from a Chihuahua, get a Great Dane, right? We have all these different breeds. And so every time you're using a pesticide product, what you're really saying to that insect population is, here's a challenge. Those of you who can overcome this challenge, go on and breed next year. So then you use that same product next year and you say, okay, now especially anybody who can survive this, go ahead and you keep living next year. And so we get the development of resistance to these products because we're just giving them an opportunity. And so something like prescribed burning, it's not something that they can get resistant to. It's not a chemical pressure. It's something that they naturally have been exposed to. And so whether they are resistant to pesticides or not, they will be equally targeted by something like fire.
And Cassandra, as we're talking about ticks, wanting to make a quick mention that as you've been out and about around Manhattan, you're already starting to see some.
Yeah. So we were out yesterday, and within half an hour of setting our traps, what we do is we put out carbon dioxide, because that's one of the cues that they know that there is an animal around is carbon dioxide, because that's what we breathe out. And within an hour, we had one male and one female Lone Star tick crawling up. They were a little bit cold and sluggish and really excited about the thought of a juicy meal. But yeah, we're seeing it earlier. Everybody has been commenting about how warm we are so early on in the year. And so this is one of the things that they detect. They detect the daylight hours and they detect how warm it is. So the moment it warms up, they're going to come out and try and find a meal as soon as possible. And that's an important thing for burning, because we want to get them before they wake up. And so now we've got a situation of it's been really windy. If we've been in Manhattan, you've been getting the alerts of no burn days. We're getting insects coming out really early. So hopefully anybody who's wanting to do a spring burn for external parasite control can get it in pretty soon, because we've already noticing them waking up.
And where can people find more information on this?
This was published in the Cattleman's Day report, so you can read it there. The study was done at the K-State Beefstocker Unit, and we're eternally thankful for them letting us use their equipment and drive around and do crazy things. So we're going to publish the tick results. We're going to do some pathogen testing on the ticks. But the hornfly study that is actually looking at both this year, this last grazing year, and 2019, before the study started, the burning study started. So that's really great. We're going to be publishing that soon. Bottom line is, all people really need to know is burning is great for external parasite control and in our grassland ecosystem, and that spring burn, whether it's flies or ticks, seems to be more effective. But if you can't do a spring burn, don't worry about it. You don't lose all the effects. Burning overall is fantastic for external parasite control.
That was K-State veterinary entomologist Cassandra Olds. I will link this study in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we round out our Friday show with a weather update with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, something really important to talk about is we've got some moisture on the ground.
Yeah, we had a good batch of moisture for portions of central and eastern Kansas. Over the last 24 hours, totals anywhere from a couple tenths of an inch in the central part of the state to over an inch in portions along the Missouri border. So we'll take it. That's some good moisture, and honestly, it's been needed because we've actually seen this week, for the first time in several months, we saw drought expansion in the state of Kansas. We saw a lot of D0 that was added to south central Kansas. And it's because we've been so dry over the last few weeks. We average anywhere from about half an inch of moisture in the eastern part of the state to a couple tenths of an inch of moisture or less in the western part of the state. So we need a lot of moisture to keep up, and we just haven't had anything for weeks, like 20-plus days. There was a little corridor of sleet and hail, or not hail, but sleet and a very, very small grapple across central Kansas last week, but that wasn't very much. And so this rain was really needed to help offset some of that recent dryness. But we look at bigger picture, we've been digging ourselves a bigger hole, and we're going to need constant precipitation to keep up, especially with the vegetation growing as it is. It's starting to use up a lot of moisture, and we're well above normal in the spring leaf out and the spring flowering. It's moving north much quicker, and therefore it's sucking more moisture out of the ground, and we need this rainfall to keep up with it.
However, are we going to dry out this weekend?
Yeah, we're going to see conditions after this system moves out by Friday afternoon. We're going to dry back out with a pretty potent cold front. So it'll be cooler than normal on Saturday, and warming back up on Sunday, but overall drier conditions, lower humidity again. We'll get down into the upper 20s, low 30% range. And despite recent precipitation, that means that grass will still burn. And I expect a lot of folks to probably be burning this weekend, which, if that meets their objectives, that's great. But just be cognizant of, despite the recent moisture, grass can still dry out in an hour. It can still burn very efficiently and aggressively. And so just be smart despite things drying out this weekend.
Chip, we've talked a lot about above normal temperatures. And so does that create some concern for freezing?
Yeah, like I mentioned, everything's growing faster than normal. The wheat's at a greater stage than it usually is. We've seen the growing degree days accumulate much faster. So the wheat, flowering trees, lilacs, the pretty flowers, as well as apple trees and those kind of things, and cherries and whatnot, they're all blooming earlier than normal this year because of this warmer than normal temperatures. And we don't have to have a significant cold snap anymore to have some significant impact to the agricultural needs, because we can just get below 20 degrees for an hour or two, and that could be enough for some pretty potent damage as far along as we are. And so while we don't have cold weather in the forecast, we've got warming temperatures next week. We're probably going to get back up to the 70s by early next week, but we still have the potential for a brief cold snap anytime really through May. We could see freezes as late as May, and so we need to just be cognizant that this is a good thing that we're greening up and getting moisture, but it's also bad because we're increasing our vulnerability for frost or freeze risk.
And Chip, in terms of fire and moisture, what do we see for next week?
Yeah, well, it's spring in Kansas, so if we're not getting rain, we'll probably have fire risk, and so we're going to see that evolve again early next week. Those warming temperatures, see gusty winds out of the south on Monday and even potentially into Tuesday, and that's going to increase our fire weather concerns. Humidity starts coming up middle of next week. As another system moves in, that should help bring the temperatures down by later in the week, and a potential another round of precipitation. I'm thinking mostly just eastern Kansas right now for the end of next week. And then after that, it looks like we start to dry out. We get more of a stale pattern, not as active, not as much potential for storm systems like we've seen. And temperatures more normal and drier conditions into the later part of the month.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us once again and give us our weather update.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was Kansas State University meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.